Pageant selection. There's an old adage in dating that 90% of success in dating is selection. And it's really, really true. I think it applies just as much to pageantry. And I'm sure that you can think of an example in your life when, because I really think dating is a good analogy for selecting a beauty pageant that is suitable for you. You've seen two people who, on paper, look like they'd be a really, really good fit, and then they go on a date, and what happens? There's no chemistry. And as much as it might look good on paper, it just doesn't work. Doesn't mean that they don't try to pursue it, but that's another matter. And then on the other hand, you've seen two people who on paper just don't seem to have anything in common, and for some reason it clicks, they work, and they get married happily ever after. And I've had examples of this in my life. I had a relationship where it was based primarily on my belief that because we had something in common. I mean, there was something that was very close to me. I mean, it was tennis. I love tennis. So we had tennis in common. We both played tennis. And I thought, oh, that's the basis for a good relationship. And suffice to say, it wasn't enough. I mean, it wasn't bad for the relationship. Having interest in common is not bad for a relationship, but it's not enough. And when it comes to pageants, the reason that I think dating is a really good analogy is because, yes, you're going to do your research. And what we're going to do here is I'll give you seven things to look for. I think they're fairly common sense if you've been in the industry for a while, but if you're a brand new beginner, then you may not have thought of these things. You may not even have known to look for these things. And even if you're a seasoned veteran, it doesn't hurt to check. But the reason that the dating analogy for me works is because outside of the research that I'm going to get you to do, sometimes it's just a good fit and sometimes it's not. And if you've done any number of pageants, you'll know this to be true. Sometimes you go into a pageant and it just feels right. And then other times you enter a pageant and it just doesn't feel like you. Doesn't even mean necessarily you have a bad time. It just means that you don't feel it's the right pageant for you. And by the way, I'm not taking into account here that some pageant systems have had really bad reports of abusing their contestants or misleading their contestants or not giving them what they paid for. Obviously, if that's happened, then don't enter that pageant. And if you hear from a reputable source that there's some sort of scandal or there's some sort of underhanded or dishonest or criminal activity, then don't enter that pageant. I think that goes without saying, but I just want to say that up front. We're going to go through seven things that you should look for in a pageant when you're doing your research to determine whether it's the right pageant for you. But it's not saying that, just look at these seven, but if the pageant has been in the papers for doing something that's really, really sinister or narcissistic, I'll enter it anyway because on paper it looks good. No, 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 no. Trust your gut on this one. If it feels bad, run for the hills. And if it comes around later, new directorship, whatever, you can always revisit later. But does that make sense? I just want to start with that. If you get a bad feeling about it, don't enter. I mean, it's possible to be paranoid, I guess, but I think from my experience anyway, in the industry over the last several years and interviewing over 300 of you, if it feels bad, just don't do it. Just like with photography, as an example. So we're going to go through seven things. Okay. Number one, I want you to start by creating your own list. Now, this is a list similar again to dating. If you were to go, if you're single and you're looking for a partner, I don't think it ever hurts to have a list of things that you both want and things that you don't want. Now, of course, I think it's possible to be too picky. I don't think if you have 10 pages of things that you want from your prospective partner and then 10 pages of things that you don't want, that might be setting the bar a little bit too high, particularly if your standards for yourself aren't quite so high. I really do think that if you're going to go into a dating scene, you want to make sure that you've got your standards for yourself set pretty high, not just for the prospective partner. But when I say start by creating your own list, so we're talking about pageantry here. So, for example, you might want to advocate for a particular cause. Maybe you want to advocate for the environment, against single-use plastics, as an example. Well, not every pageant allows you to choose your own advocacy. Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing. There are definite reasons why some pageants want you or require you to advocate for a certain cause. And that's individual to each system. But if you wanted to advocate against single-use plastic, then obviously a pageant such as Miss Earth, which has a heavy environmental focus, would be a natural fit. Now, could you take that same advocacy and take it into other pageants? Yes, assuming that they allow you to pick your own advocacy. But for example, Miss Grand Australia here partners with Destiny Rescue, which is a organization that helps end the child trafficking, the child slavery trafficking that occurs largely in Southeast Asia and some other countries. So your advocacy, whilst you have it, wouldn't be the central focus. So start by creating the list of things that you want and you don't want. So, for example, you might only be willing to dedicate a week to the pageant. You don't want to have to be competing for a month. You might want to just compete for a day. You might require the pageant to be within a certain radius of where you are so you don't have to travel. Maybe it's something as simple as you need to be able to work the pageant around your work. So it can't be, and you're not willing or unable to take time off. So maybe you need the pageant to be on a weekend, or at least like starting on a Friday night after work and then running on the weekend so you can get back to work on Monday. So start by creating your own list. And if you're not sure what's possible or not, or what's reasonable or not, I would actually say just create the list anyway. I think once you sort of get into pageantry more, you can sort of get boxed in thinking of, okay, this is acceptable, this is not. I'd rather you just start with a list. And even if one of the demands or one of your things that you want sounds a bit outrageous, I think it's a good place to start just to get it out of your system and then go, okay, this is what I want, and then here's what's possible and what can we work with. The other thing I'd suggest when you're creating your list is work out, okay, you got your list of stuff you want, but out of those things, what are the maybe three things that are absolute musts to have? So the other ones are kind of nice to have, but these one, two, or three things are absolute musts. And if the pageant doesn't have this, then I'm not going to enter. And you might do it on the other side as well, things you don't want in the pageant. Pick out the one, two, or three things that are absolute just giant red flags. Like if the pageant has that, you're not doing it. For some of you, it might be the swimsuit section. That's a really good example. So for some of you, swimsuit section, not entering. For some of you, doesn't have a swimsuit section, not entering. So we're going to start by creating our own list. So you get a handle on, well, what is it that I'm actually looking for? Because if you do the research, but you don't know what you're looking for, kind of defeats the purpose of doing the research. It's like when you don't know what you want to eat, but you know you're hungry. It takes sometimes forever to pick a restaurant. Sure, you've been there before. So start by creating your own list. Number two, this is a basic one. Check the eligibility rules. The typical ones here are age, marital status, and children. Age is often under 25, although for some reason that's now moved to kind of 28. In Global's case, it's under 35, I believe. But and that's the eligibility, I should say, for the Miss section, which is a main section of most pageants. So for a Miss pageant, it's often between 18 and 28. But as I said, 18 to 25 has happened and 18 to 35 has happened. So, and those are in constant flux. For example, the Miss America organization recently upped its maximum age from 25 to 28. So you want to check in on the pageant's website. Don't check in on like pageant fan websites because that's secondhand information. Marital status, that is simply, are you married or not? It's not relationship status. Just get those two clear in your head. You could be, a long-term relationship, but it's about whether you are married or not, or whether you're divorced or not. So check that. And then also children, whether you have children or not. Some pageants also stipulate whether you've ever had children, and you really want to dig into that. I'm not saying that I agree or disagree with the eligibility rules, by the way. What I am saying is that the pageant has their rules, and being a private entity, they're entitled to in some respects, to their own eligibility rules. So I don't advise being that person who, let's say the cutoff is 28 and you're 35, and then you email them and badger them as to why you should be allowed to compete. You could do that to a certain extent. And, I think the extension of the age rules is a good thing. Like it's going from 25, for example, to 20. I think that's a good thing. But I think be respectful of the system as well. That has to be said because, it is a private entity and they have the right to cast the rules as they see fit, whether you agree with it or not, whether I agree with it or not. it's kind of another conversation completely. There's going to be a pageant out there that would accept you very happily. Um, so, number three, components and scoring. I put here in brackets if available. So, by components, I mean, what are the actual components of competition? And then also, not only what are the components, but what are their various weightings or scoring? Now, very often that's not available, which I dislike. I much prefer it when the pageant is upfront as to, I mean, they normally will tell you the components, but they may not tell you the different weightings for those components. So, for example, let's say interview, very often a component, and it might say 25% or 25 out of 100, whatever it is, or might say 50%. Might have a swimsuit section, might not, might have a gown section, fun fashion, um, and it could have any other number of components, sometimes optional components as well. I know in some pageants, for example, the talent section or the fitness section are optional extras. So look at the components, look at the scoring, and for example, if you are really, again, heavily based on, let's say you really want to enter a pageant where it's really based on getting to know the person and what they stand for, then you're probably looking at a pageant that has higher, certainly it should have interview, and it should have some sort of advocacy scoring as well. And you probably want that to be reasonably heavily weighted. If you really want to shine an interview and you really want to focus on your advocacy, and 80% of the scoring is based on stage, or 100% of it's based on stage, then you're probably not entering the best pageant for yourself. Not to say that you can't win, because maybe you present on stage really well. Just saying it might not be the best pageant for you. Number four, it's a pretty obvious one, but cost. Now, you may have a certain price range in mind, a budget in mind, but the thing to consider here is there will almost always be an upfront like application cost or something similar to that, and you really want to look at, okay, not only what the cost is, but what is it covering. So very often when you enter a pageant and you pay your entry fee, and there are all sorts of different names for it, so you need to think on your own feet here. Could be a registration fee, but what does that fee cover? So for example, I want you to look, does it cover accommodation or not? Does it cover accommodation for the entire pageant? For example, it might just cover part of it, but let's say you need to stay in a couple extra days because you win. Does it cover that? So does it cover accommodation? Does it cover the food whilst you're there? Does it cover 3 square meals? Does it just cover breakfast? What sort of breakfast is it? Is it a buffet breakfast, a continental breakfast, or just a couple of wheat bix? Does it cover travel costs to and from the pageant? And whilst I'm saying this, by the way, I'm not saying that every pageant should cover everything. I'm saying do your research so you know what's covered and what you may have to pay out of your own pocket. Sometimes they will cover, or the pageant will sponsor the gown section, for example, so you won't have to buy your own gown. That's something to consider. And then all the ancillary costs. Obviously, when you go there, you're going to have to spend some of your own money. It's not going to, I don't think there's ever been a pageant where they pay for the travel, they pay for the accommodation, they pay for all the food, and you just need to turn up. I'd be surprised if that's the case. Maybe it's happened. I don't know. If it has, let me know. But again, it's not just the cost. You also need to figure out what's covered, because then you also need to answer, well, what's not covered and what am I going to have to pay out of my own pocket? And as I've already mentioned in the component section, sometimes there are optional components, and very often there's an additional entry fee to enter those components. The bonus being, you go like, why would I want to do that? Well, there might be separate awards for winning a optional component, or it could actually contribute to your overall scoring as well. So that's cost. Duration, I think, is fairly self explanatory. We have pageants ranging from 1 day to 4 weeks in the case of something like a Miss World or a Miss Grand on the international stage. So you're going to have to work out how much time you can actually put into the pageant. And by the way, if you are a working girl and you're hustling hard and you can't afford to take off 4 weeks to do a pageant, I respect that a lot. And I personally think that makes you a better title holder, because you're doing something worthwhile, let's say, in the background. You're just not doing nothing, sitting at home, and then you dedicate your entire life to a pageant. I often think that doesn't end very well. I think a title holder is a role model, and I think part of being a good model is having your career sorted out, whether that is being a stay at home mum or being a CEO. That's your choice. Equal respect for both, but the duration really does come into it. And look, if you're a mother, you may not have the time to enter a pageant at all. So the duration, do they need you there for 1 day? Do they need you there for 4 weeks? What about in the lead up? Are there going to be training events that you are required to attend? Or they say it's optional, but it's kind of like it is kind of required, because if you don't turn up, they look at you funny. You know what I mean? And then also, if you win, will you be required to, let's say, stay an extra day? And the other component is duration wise. If you win, you might have certain obligations that you need to fulfill now, given that you're the title holder, and that might be a significant investment in your time. You may be required to travel all over the United States, for example, to promote the pageant or to promote your advocacy, or even within your state. And this all adds up. So we talked about cost, which is a financial cost. Duration is really the time cost that's involved. And that can be a big thing to consider for a lot of you, given how busy a lot of you are. Now, number six is is there a national or international component? If you are brand new to the industry, what you may not know is that sometimes, for example, the Australian pageant, so we'll take Miss World as an example, Miss World Australia, if you win at Miss World Australia, you are then required to compete at Miss World International representing Australia. If you are unable or unwilling to do that, very often it's stipulated that you will have to forfeit the crown, and the crown normally then is passed over to your first runner up. If they are unable or unwilling to do it, then it's to the second runner up, etc., etc., etc. So, I mean, this comes back to the cost and time equation and considerations again. Is, well, if you win, are you actually going to be able to fulfill are you actually going to be able to compete at the national and international pageant? Because if not, then if you win, you're going to have to give up the crown. And it's kind of like, in some ways, it's a bit of disrespect to the system, because you should know that a part of the requirement of winning is that you have to compete at a follow up pageant. And if you're flat out, you're not going to be able to do that, or you don't want to do that, then I would say don't take the title away from someone else. Find a pageant that doesn't require you to do that. I mean, hey, you are able to do whatever you want, but that's just the way I look at it. So have a look at whether there's a follow up component to it if you win, or in some cases, if you're the royal court, let's say the top five or the top four, whatever it is, there may be requirements for those as well. Very often, there's a requirement, as an example, for the first runner up. The first runner up has to be willing and able to take the winner's spot if the winner is unable to fulfill her role. The last one we'll cover here is the other research. Now, this is you go onto the pageant's website as an example, look at their social media, try and find their past competitors. I've deliberately not said past winners. A lot of people say go and message the past winners or look at the past winners. The problem is the winners very often are not in a place where they can be completely honest with you, because they could get contractually into a lot of trouble if they are a title holder for a system. You ask them about the system, and then they tell you something that's negative or potentially negative about the system, and then let's say you screenshot that, or someone screenshots it and puts it out in public, they could be dethroned. I'm sure there have been examples of that. None have really come to mind recently that I'm aware of, but that's just something to consider. So don't just look at the past winners, look at the past competitors. I often think that a really good sign is that if someone has competed in a system again and again and again and again, like 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, because within reason, a sane person is not going to compete at the same pageant multiple times if they didn't enjoy it and if they didn't feel like they were getting something out of it, even when they didn't win. Because you can't compete at a pageant by and large twice if you've already won it. So if they're coming back and again, they haven't won it, but they keep coming back. I think that's a really good sign. So, and the other thing here, I said director. Now, I'm sure some directors are going to hate me for saying this, but I like my directors to be very hardworking, very disciplined, very organized, but I don't like them wanting to be the center of attention. I'm sorry. Like, if that offends you as a director, I think your time, if you were, and this is where very often directors are previous title holders or previous pageant contestants themselves. And I do think that's a good thing in the balance of it. But if they're sort of like trying to live vicariously by taking your time on stage, I liken it to the mum, the overbearing mum, who's trying to live out their dream through their daughter, if that makes sense. And look, I'll give you an example of this. There was a pageant over here in Australia, and when it came time to announce the winner, and I found this out afterwards, the director, who was a woman, had organized for her at that time fiance to no, at that time her boyfriend to propose to her on stage. Now, if it had been spontaneous, that's one thing, but for a director to organize for that to take place on stage around the same time that her new queens had just been crowned, I don't think that's romantic. I think that's incredibly selfish. I think the director's job is to get as much spotlight as possible by doing the marketing, doing all the business side of it, then taking that big spotlight and shining it on her title holders. Now, that's my belief. You might have a different belief completely. And I say, look, whatever works for you, go for it. But I've just seen some pretty unfortunate side effects of directors who just can't give up the limelight themselves. So, if that bothers you, if it doesn't bother you, that's your call. But this all falls under the other research part. I will say that if you go to a pageant's website or you look at their socials and there's a lot of spelling errors or grammatical errors, or it just seems like it's promising you the moon, the earth, the sun, and everything underneath, and it just seems a bit too good to be true, it probably is. And, some people have said I'm attacking people who are dyslexic. I'm not. But in this day and age where we have so many spelling and grammatical checks, if a system is putting up a professional website that is full of spelling and grammatical errors, it's not so much as spelling and grammar that I care about, it's the details. It's the fact that they're not oriented on the details and they don't care enough to get it right that I think you should really, really consider. Because if they're not too finicky on getting things right, how are they going to treat you? I've seen some contracts behind the scenes. Now, contracts are legal documents where the spelling and the grammar has been awful. And the things that there've been factual errors in the contract. And then they expect you to sign it and it becomes a legally binding document. So these are the things that I look at and I consider. I want my systems to have a professional website. And by professional, I don't mean it needs to be $1 million, but the spelling is good. The grammar is good. It's clear as to what's expected at the pageant. What are the dates of the pageant? How much does it cost? What gets covered by the cost? It's got links to its social media. It's got a clear contact page. It may not have a phone number, but it's got an email address. And hey, if you send an email, do you get a response within a day, a week, or 5 years, or you never get a response? So these are all things to consider. I've run through 7 things pretty quickly here. You may have other things that you like to look at. And if you have any of those, please put them below because I'd love to add them to my list if I think they're applicable. But the bottom line is do your research. I've given you here 7 things to be a bit more specific with that research, especially if you're new. You say, hey, yes, I know it's good to do my research, Adrian, but what am I actually looking for? So I've given you 7 things to look for here. You may look for other things. You may not look at some of these things. You might find that some of these things are much more important to you than other people, and that's all well and good. What I'm saying is, forearmed is forewarned. Please don't go into a pageant blind because I have seen that end really badly time and time again. Particularly, I have to say, if you're headhunted on social media and someone DMs you to say, hey, you'd be perfect for our pageant, and then you look at where the pageant is and it's in some overseas country where you'd have to travel to and potentially they insist that you give up your passport, run for the hills. It is not worth it. Do not do that. I had some of the worst experiences told to me by girls who have done exactly that. It goes to their head that they're told they've been headhunted. It's like, oh, out of all the girls in America or Australia, the UK, you headhunted me. They're reaching out to 10, 20 girls at a time, just waiting for one person to say yes. Then they get you to pay your entry fee. You never see that money again. And a lot of the time, it ends just, it's basically a scam, isn't it? So please, please, please do your research. Whichever pageant you're entering, I hope this has been helpful for you. If you have any questions, put them in the comments below, or you can send me an email on info@thepageantproject.com, and I'll be happy to help you as best I can. But please, please, please do your research.